Hello, I'm Things Too Much, and welcome to my video. Today we're going to be taking a look at Rage, one of id's more recent titles that, while fun, hasn't reached the level of classic like their other titles such as Doom and Quake. Rage is a complicated title. It's really fun, but does it deserve the level of classic like the other titles it created? I'm going to be going into why or why not. Let's get started.
id Software is synonymous in the gaming community as innovators, pioneers, legends, and any other positive word you can think of. You can't play games today without knowing just how important id Software was to the gaming community as we know it today. Their revolutionary titles such as Wolfenstein 3D and Doom were considered games that solidified the first-person shooter genre, with Doom becoming one of the most important games ever made. As the 90s rolled in, id would continue to create other classics such as Quake, and while these games were peerless when it comes to how fun they are, their importance in advancing video game media and technology cannot be understated. Wolfenstein 3D was more than a game where you shot Nazis, and Doom was more than a game where you shot demons from hell. With every game they released in the 90s, id was responsible for innovative technology that made their games classics. Whether it was John Carmack introducing a new graphics engine, or John Romero building complex and engaging level designs with that graphics engine, more factors than just gameplay went into id's games to make them into the legends we know today. Not surprisingly, id's successful titles got sequels that improved and refined their game mechanics and even took stronger ventures into multiplayer, with games like Quake 3 Arena. Id ruled the gaming world in the 90s, and despite controversies on how violent their games were, many childhoods were made by the games id created. Pretty much anything that id Software put out in the 90s was solid gold. However, as time passed and the new millennia rolled in, games began to change. Slowly but surely, more was needed from a game than just great gameplay and amazing graphics engines to make them a classic. During the 90s, aspects like story were not really a big concern. After all, why should they be? John Carmack himself said that story in a video game was like story in a porn movie. It was expected to be there, but it really wasn't all that important. Before id created their first revolutionary graphics engines, most games were still played on 2D planes, and the games that tried to emulate 3D environments weren't as impressive until id came in to show the world how it was done. So why worry about things like story? The 90s were a time for technology and gameplay, and id were the masters of both. But times do change, and while what was fantastic in the 90s could still be fun in the 2000s, people would eventually demand more from games. People wanted their games to have deeper meaning. They wanted to do more than just shoot things or go on quests without explanation. They wanted to feel their actions in a gaming world have bigger consequences. After all, game developers want their players to become invested in the gaming world they create, and people would get these new and deeper experiences, but from other game developers. Now to clarify, id Software would never stop innovating, especially on the technological side of gaming. But things did slow down for the company in the 2000s. While they still would excel in creating revolutionary graphics engines, their insistence in favoring technology over now equally important components such as story and setting would start to chip away at id's classic status. Doom 3 was the first look into the id way of thinking for the new generation of gaming. As a game, Doom 3 was revolutionary thanks to its id Tech 4 graphics engine, commonly known simply as the Doom 3 engine. When the game was unveiled to the world in 2002, jaws dropped and people could not believe that a game that realistic for the time could be created. The technological advancements for Doom 3 seemed like black magic, but seeing is believing, and once again it looked like id would be the creators of another masterpiece. When Doom 3 finally released in 2004, it received universal acclaim for its graphics engine. Technologically, id had once again done the impossible. No one could believe that id pulled off such an amazing looking game with dynamic lighting, shadows, and extremely high quality textures. To put it simply, people were blown away. Not only did the game look amazing, but the graphics also helped id create an ominous setting. The updated visuals and animations for the Demons of Hell were at the same time beautiful and terrifying. Not to mention that the environments gave Doom 3 a genuine sense of dread thanks to the horsepower of id Tech 4. I personally couldn't afford a computer strong enough to run Doom 3 when it first came out, but but I do have fond memories playing it on the original Xbox, where it looked almost as good as the PC version. Almost. It had created another great game, but not another classic game. While the graphics engine was light years ahead of its time, the same could not be said for other important areas such as story, multiplayer, and even gameplay. Doom 3 looked amazing, but it still played like the original Doom that was released over a decade ago and relied a little too much on monster closets to get its scares in. While not as fast paced as the original Doom in order to show off the new graphics engine, Doom 3 still had you do the same thing you did 10 years ago. You were a space marine on a base on Mars that is invaded by the forces of hell, and you kill them. Plain and simple. The fun factor was still there, and many gamers like myself enjoyed the simplicity of the gameplay, but Doom 3 didn't make the same enormous splash that the original Doom did back in 1993. The issue was that by 2004, people were starting to want more than just good gameplay and amazing graphics to make games classics. One of the quotey fingers new things people wanted in their game was story. Story in games was no longer story in a porn movie, as John Carmack once put it. Story was seen as an important factor in games to make people feel invested in what they were playing. Variety was another. Variety in gameplay, variety in setting, and variety in enemies. Games developed in the new generations after the original Doom had to learn to juggle more factors to answer the demands of the new gaming population. Id, on the other hand, Id wanted to keep innovating, even if just in the technological area, to show what they were capable of, and this made them either stubborn or visionaries depending on who you ask. Now, to their credit, the new graphics engine they decided to focus on blew all of their competition out of the water. id Tech 4 created a genuine sense of uneasiness throughout most of the game, because it looked so realistic for 2004 standards. But some people would find the environments on Mars base repetitive, which diminished some of the initial sense of dread in Doom 3. The shooting was fun and had that classic satisfying id feeling to it, but it also felt a bit repetitive as you kept killing the same zombies, imps, pinky demons, and other hellish abominations synonymous with the Doom franchise. The story, though simple, had a little more weight to it thanks to cutscenes that serve as expose for Doom 3 storytelling, and there are PDAs that contain memos that fill you in on life on Mars before the forces of hell took over. This regained some of Doom 3's sense of place and setting for Mars base, but some gamers would feel that these PDAs were awkwardly placed and would sometimes break the tension and flow of combat that the game was trying to present. But even with these issues, Doom 3 is considered by many to be a great game, and I agree. It might not be a classic as in id's previous titles, but the id Tech 4 engine and the care that went into making Doom 3 a more modernized game, with varying results of success, meant that Doom 3 would at least revolutionize on the technological side while offering an enjoyable experience everywhere else, even if it wasn't a classic one. Though graphics aren't everything, id Tech 4 went a long way to save Doom 3 from mediocrity. Not to mention the classic id shooting is a formula that no other game studio or developer can replicate. After Doom 3, id Software would take a little more time to focus on its next project. The next game would have special significance for id as the final game created under the supervision of John Carmack, the last of the original creators that made the company the icon that it is to the gaming community. This game would not be a sequel to id's established franchises and instead be a new title as id's more focused answer to the new generation of gaming. This new game was called Rage, and id would be very secretive about it until its release. The small amount of information the public knew about Rage before its release were things that were expected from id as a company. Once again, John Carmack helped id create a new graphics engine for the game called id Tech 5, and once again, the graphics engine looked like it was going to blow its competition out of the water. But the new graphics engine was more than just a pretty face. id aimed to help other developers port their games to different systems, and id Tech 5 was made so that the process of porting the game engine to other systems wouldn't be such a hassle. It was also known that the game would be another first-person shooter, and who else to make a great shooter than the granddaddies themselves? Rage was released on October 2011, with high reviews from both gamers and critics. This time, id's new game made an effort to present a more cohesive story. The game takes place in a post-apocalyptic Earth over 100 years after it is hit by a massive meteorite. You are an Ark survivor. What's an Ark survivor, you might ask? Well, before the meteorite hit Earth, the best and brightest of Earth's population were put into what can best be described as gigantic stasis pods called Arks, which were buried deep underground. The goal of these pods were to preserve humanity's best and brightest and literally raise from the Earth enough years after the meteorite hit to start rebuilding humanity. Unfortunately for your player character, your Ark seems to have malfunctioned. You awaken from your stasis pod 106 years into the future, and everyone who was buried with you has died. There remains now nothing more than skeletal forms of what they once were. With no other options, you head outside to immediately see a world that is both completely beautiful and completely destroyed. You are not out for more than a few seconds when you are attacked by one of the many bandits of the wasteland. You are saved by a wasteland survivor, Dang Hangar, and are picked up to be driven to a settlement. Along the way, you are informed of what has happened to Earth in the last 106 years since the meteorite hit. The world is mainly a wasteland, and people live in settlements for protection from both the wasteland elements and from hostile groups who seek to raid any settlement they can. A totalitarian group called the Authority also claims to be the new form of government for all in the wasteland. But many settlements aren't on board with the idea and actually oppose the Authority as they see it as some sort of dictatorship. The Authority rules with an iron fist and uses intimidation tactics such as their own soldiers and propaganda machines to have settlements fall in line. You get a few hints of a rebel group fighting against them, and you eventually join their cause. You also learn that Ark survivors like yourself are worth a lot of money to anyone who turns them into the Authority. However, lucky for you, people seem to hate the Authority more than needing some extra cash. So with this information, you go out into the wasteland to start your adventure. The post-apocalyptic setting is nothing new, but it adds its own take to it while getting inspiration from various other games and media to create a world that is very ambitious for its standards. The most notable influences were games like Fallout 3 and Borderlands, along with movies like the Mad Max series. Once again, id's new graphics engine, id Tech 5, helped establish a sense of place for Rage. The game looked amazing, and while not as big a step forward in graphics as Doom 3 was back in 2004, the graphical advancements in the id Tech 5 engine were still big enough to give it good critical praise over other games of 2011. Not only did the environments feel real, so did non-playable characters. id Tech 5 allowed for facial expressions and character movements that felt genuine. If a character was happy, sad, thankful, or whatever, you could tell just by facial movements. This wasn't just limited to characters you engaged in wasteland settlements, as enemy reactions to getting shot also reached new levels of realism with the id Tech 5 engine. id also tried new gameplay mechanics with Rage, the most surprising being a very well-made car combat system, with some racing thrown in for good measure. Car combat in games is mostly associated with the Twisted Metal series, but considering id didn't seem to possess a lot of knowledge with car combat in games, they managed to make it very enjoyable in Rage. The car combat adds a layer of well-implemented gaming mechanics to Rage that complement the rest of the gameplay, story, and the semi-open world environment. Not to mention adding a Mad Max feel when you drive from point A to point B. The shooting in Rage is fantastic, as expected for an id game. Not only does the shooting feel powerful and satisfying, but light RPG elements were added to make the shooting more visceral. You can now collect components and junk in the game, and while the junk can be sold at vendors in wasteland settlements for cash, the components are used to create offensive and defensive weapons, as well as gadgets such as turrets and even spider robots with attached machine guns to aid you in combat. It might not be a deep system, but seeing a spider robot attack an enemy in an intelligent manner in the new id Tech 5 engine is really impressive. The enemies are no slouches either, especially when you go against Authority soldiers who not only take cover, but some are equipped with force fields and their buddies team up behind them as they advance on you. It's really impressive stuff. So, you have an actual and cohesive story in an id game. You have new elements such as car combat combined with a semi-open world environment that complement each other very well, and even light RPG elements that add to the fun of id's classic shooting. In other words, you have all the ingredients for another id classic. But again, it didn't turn out that way. While enjoyable and ambitious, it once again could not reach a classic status with Rage, just like it couldn't with Doom 3. But why? Unlike Doom 3, Rage focused on other gameplay areas and not just their unique shooting and a technologically advanced graphics engine. The story had more weight to it, and it succeeded in introducing new mechanics that they had little experience with. Not to mention that it made an honest attempt to create a unique world for Rage. Well, simply put, while Rage was a great game, it was still playing catch up in many important factors, which prevented Rage from being the classic in the likes of Doom and Quake. It did adapt to new generations of gaming for the most part, but the company still had a few things to learn. To start out, while the story in Rage was more meaningful for id standards, overall it still fell short of what other games were already offering. Rage starts out with enough mystery to keep you invested in its world. As you progress through the game, you find wasteland settlements that initially bring the universe of Rage to life. You can interact with wasteland settlers, do a few side tasks for them if you want, and even play a few fun minigames to collect extra cash. However, Rage makes a bunch of small mistakes that make its world feel stale. A good example is that you can only interact with people in these settlements as long as they have something useful or interesting to say. Once their usefulness is spent, you can't interact with them anymore. Not even a quote that loops over and over is an option. It's nice to see people in settlements walk around and go about their business like in games such as Fallout 3, but like Fallout 3, it would also have been good to have more interactions with these people even if they didn't have anything particularly useful to say. Now, Rage is mainly a shooter, and some might find it unfair to hold its world-building capacity to the same level as a game like Fallout 3, which is a game entirely devoted to world building. But a few bits of dialogue to non-playable characters here and there would have gone a long way to make the wasteland settlements in Rage feel more alive, and I don't think that's too much to ask. Considering how well all the characters in Rage show emotion in the new graphics engine, it becomes jarring when some characters just stand there staring at you blankly after just talking with them. Narrative flow is another problem. As I mentioned before, the post-apocalyptic idea has been done many times in games, so Rage had to come up with unique ideas to engage gamers. But while the ideas were there, the pace of the story wasn't doing the game any favors. The story takes too long to get to the point, which makes considerable parts of Rage feel like filler. You're an ARC survivor, and because of that, you're being hunted down by the Authority. You are forced to go from settlement to settlement in order to avoid the Authority from catching you, but why are you being hunted by the Authority? Why are you so important or dangerous to them in the first place? And what do they get out of catching you anyway? A little over halfway through the game, these questions eventually get answered when you finally join a resistance group, very originally called The Resistance, but not before going on several story-related missions that elongate you from getting this information. Now, to be fair, these missions make sense in a practical way since you are basically a fugitive and the settlements will offer you protection as long as you're useful to them, which basically means doing a bunch of menial tasks. While still fun, it does not explain why important information is withheld from you until you're almost halfway through the game. You find out that you have tiny bots in your blood called nanotrites that give you your special abilities, like revive yourself when you're fatally wounded by enemies. You also learn that a man known as General Cross is the leader of the Authority, and he wants to capture all ARC survivors because he's afraid they might pose a threat to his form of government. Cross himself is an ARC survivor, and somehow before the meteorite hit Earth, Cross rigged all ARC programs so that only his ARC and the ARCs of people loyal to him would rise earlier than planned to begin building a world based on their vision. As for the other ARC survivors not loyal to Cross, he either sabotaged the ARCs by making sure they would never rise, or, as your player character can attest, made sure to capture any stragglers whose ARCs he couldn't control. Any ARC survivors captured by Cross were either coerced into joining his cause, or worse, experimented on, as the Authority also seems to have something to do with mutants roaming in the wasteland. The mutants are like feral humans who always melee attack the player, are extremely agile, and by the end of the game, the Authority has actually found a way to control them. Okay, so eventually the story gains momentum again and regains your attention. But in one of the most infuriating cliffhangers in gaming, your last mission has you go to the Authority base to raise all the ARCs that are still buried all over the world. This is done to awaken more Ark survivors and create a stronger resistance. And when you finally succeed, you cut to credits. That's it. You don't see the results of your success, you don't learn how Cross was able to create the authority in the first place, hell, you don't even see Cross's face. All this to set up a sequel which is very doubtful to ever be released. I mean, what the fuck? It becomes really frustrating because right when the story starts to go somewhere interesting again, it ends in the name of sequel bait. Okay, so maybe the story in Rage leaves us wanting more, but we all know story isn't id's strong point. Id has made a name for themselves with satisfying gameplay and amazing technological achievements, and Rage delivers on most of that. As mentioned before, the shooting is fantastic, giving you that unique sense of satisfaction that can only come from an id game. Unlike Doom 3, the shooting in Rage escapes the feeling of repetitiveness thanks to the RPG-like crafting system of weapons and gadgets that allow you to tackle a combat situation in a variety of ways. It's not a deep system, and the choices of gadgets you can build are limited, but you do have enough options to tackle combat situations in different ways. Some people saw the simplicity of the crafting system as a flaw, citing that id should have made the crafting system more complex in order to have more choices. I personally think this is unfair. While more choices would have been nice, id was already taking a risk with adding a crafting system to its iconic shooting. After all, id knows their shooting, and a game like Rage was already exploring new ground for the company in terms of gameplay. Is it really fair to ask for more out of a crafting system that Rage probably did not need in the first place? If the crafting system didn't work out the way id had planned, it would have irredeemably hurt the shooting in Rage. And for a first-person shooter, that would have been a big problem. Thankfully, the risk paid off, and while it isn't a deep system, in this case, I don't think it needs to be. It makes the shooting a lot more fun, and that's all it needs to do. The driving and car combat also help avoid the feeling of repetitiveness. Besides equipping your ride with guns and rockets to defend yourself, you can choose to race in settlement circuits to win upgrades for your car. These circuits have the standard race and battle races that feel like a gritty version of Mario Kart. The only one that doesn't really work is one called Race Rallies. These are pretty much capture the waypoint but with your car. These just feel tedious and not as enjoyable at all because you rely on cheap tactics to win. They suck. Plain and simple, they suck. However, you can't completely ignore them and still choose the normal races and battle races, which are vastly more enjoyable, and still upgrade your car to be a machine of death. Surprisingly, a more understandable complaint was on Rage's new graphics engine, id Tech 5. For all its good intentions and advancements, the id Tech 5 engine was not flawless. The engine looked amazing, but it also put frame rate over graphical quality so players could have a smoother gameplay experience. This meant that the game would run on a steady 60 frames per second no matter what. No stuttering, no slowdown, no pauses, nothing. However, this also meant that some textures would take a few seconds to load, and while some people were able to bear it for the sake of a smooth frame rate, for others it ruined their gaming experience completely. id Tech 5 looked amazing, but more often than not you would have to wait for textures to load before you could appreciate the hard work id put into their new graphics engine. This is better known as texture popping, and it is seen as a big flaw in games because it breaks your immersion. Games have reached a level of prominence where playing them is an experience, and anything that can break that experience can be really annoying when you are trying to immerse yourself in the game world. Texture popping reminds us that you are playing a game rather than having an experience. You start to think of the game as playing in a world made of lines and codes rather than sharing in the imaginations of the game developers. While a large number of people could play Rage and be okay with the fact that texture pop-in is the price you pay for a good frame rate in a technologically advanced graphics engine, the number of people who saw this as a big problem was large enough to add to the reasons why Rage, while great, didn't become a classic. The engine itself would not reach its full potential until years later with games such as Wolfenstein: The New Order. By 2011, making graphics more realistic wasn't such a big deal as it once was. It wasn't enough to just have an amazing graphics engine, you had to do something creative with it. Rage did this by creating a unique post-apocalyptic world that was beautiful, if a little blurry and empty. Now, calling the actual wasteland in Rage an open world environment is a bit of a stretch. It's true that you can explore the wasteland if you desire, but it is not as big or as lively as the game would like you to believe. Besides a few scripted events, challenges, and car combat scenarios, the wasteland itself feels a little empty. Rage's Wasteland feels like it is there to give more time and meaning to the car combat system, since you're going from settlement to settlement means you'll be ambushed by different factions of wasteland bandits, which allows you to create some serious carnage. There are random chances in the wasteland for you to gather extra materials, and also a few challenges that offer component parts for crafting, but the game doesn't encourage the player enough to explore for potential rewards. Everything that the player will need for their journey will either be in the wasteland settlements or in hostile territories the player has to go to in order to complete their mission. Now, you will find out that there are sewers located in some parts of the wasteland. These sewers are filled with mutants, but if you can make it to the end, you'll be rewarded with ammo, components to build gadgets, and valuable junk that you can sell for money. These sewers give Rage the reward for exploration aspect that it really needs. Unfortunately, there are not a lot of opportunities like this in the wasteland, but at the very least, the wasteland serves as a fun distraction while you get from point A to point B. id Software would add to Rage with a DLC pack called The Scorchers, which would add some new weapons, areas, and a side story that, while inconsequential to the main game, is still very fun. To start the DLC, you go into a cave door in the hangar settlement, which was previously locked. You enter to investigate some underground tremors, and before long, the ground below you gives in, and you fall unconscious. You awaken to be saved by a woman called Sarah, who, despite the hostile wasteland environment, sports a tank top and really short shorts. Sarah herself even mentions the impracticality of her choice of clothing in a battle situation, which doesn't make her wardrobe any less ridiculous, but at least it's mentioned, and you have to kind of smirk for that. After she rescues you, the two of you split up to see what's causing the tremors. You're attacked by both mutants and a new wasteland bandit group called the Scorchers, hence the name of the DLC. Now, technically, the Scorchers do make an appearance in the main game without the DLC. They are the bandits that attack you with their cars outside the dead city. I never knew these bandits were a completely different faction until I played this DLC. To a small degree, the DLC gives this group of bad guys some backstory, but it ultimately doesn't matter. You find out the Scorchers are threatening the wasteland with something called Firestorm, which is some sort of floating battleship which has enough firepower to destroy any wasteland settlement. The tremors were a result of the Scorchers digging for feltrite, which is this mysterious element that was brought in by the meteorite that hit over 100 years ago, which is also used for fuel to power up Firestorm. So it is up to you and your new pal Sarah to stop the Scorchers before they can get their battleship off the ground. Now, despite her appearance, Sarah herself is a very likable character. She's sarcastic, sassy, and takes no shit from no one. She has no qualms telling you what to do, and she's good with weapons. She even interrogates a former Scorchers member by throwing a wind stick at him, which is the game's version of a sharp boomerang used for silent kills. One of the unique weapons in the DLC is the nail gun, and fans of its classic Quake will immediately appreciate the fan service it gives with this weapon, and even if you have no connections to the Quake series, the weapon is still a blast to use in Rage. Its addition in the game is flawless, as the nail gun feels like a weapon that should have been in the game since its release. The best part about the nail gun is that it becomes part of your permanent arsenal after you complete the DLC, which lasts about 2 to 4 hours depending on how slow you want to take things. You infiltrate a Scorcher base, participate in a literal kill to survive reality TV show, bribe a Scorcher snitch to give you information, and finally attack the area the Scorchers are hiding Firestorm to put an end to their evil plans. During the last mission, Sarah gets captured and she is relegated to the damsel in distress trope, which is annoying because up to this point in the DLC, she has a take charge attitude, even if she is over-sexualized. But of course, you stop the Scorchers from advancing their evil plans and rescue Sarah before both of you go back to the settlement of Wellspring. Your final reward in this DLC is a trophy room. Now every mission you complete will be up in the walls for you to see. Rage has a few Easter eggs that harken back to its classic titles such as Doom and Quake, and if you find them in the game, they will appear in your trophy room. Oh, and Sarah stays in the trophy room for whatever is left of the game. Now, I know I'm going to open a large can of worms by saying this, but now Sarah is relegated to a trophy woman at this point. After rescuing her from the Scorchers, the only place that you can see her again is the trophy room, where, if you interact with her, she will make obvious sexual suggestions to you. After being given a likable attitude, she is now just your trophy. Her placement in the trophy room after her role in the DLC is done is a not so subtle hint. Many people want to ignore this suggestion of the trophy woman by saying that it's not that bad or that those who point it out are being overly dramatic, but it doesn't change the fact that Sarah's role once the DLC is over is still a problem. Now, I love my lovely looking ladies any day, and as a straight man myself, TNA is very attractive to me. But I also love when these characters are given more presence in the game they're in, especially with a short DLC pack like the Scorchers. But still, for $5, the Scorchers DLC is a good deal, and none of the flaws I had can erase the fact that I had fun. The DLC pack was supposed to fix a few flaws that were present with the main game, mainly the pop-in textures, but I barely noticed any difference. So after all these points, what are we to make of Rage? Is it another one of its classic games? Well, no. Is it still a well put together, enjoyable, and great, albeit flawed title? Yes. Should you play it? I'd say yeah. Rage is not a classic, but it doesn't have to be for people to enjoy the world it creates through the magic that only id Software can deliver. I think people unfairly dismiss this title because it didn't reach that elusive classic status that earlier id games reached in the 90s. But id should be commended by us as gamers for trying something new that involved more than just pretty graphics and shooting. We may never get a sequel to Rage, but we still have this game to remind us that with a little more practice, id can create another classic game in the future. But for now, if you by any chance see Rage sitting on a store shelf, give it a chance. You'll find out that a game doesn't have to be a classic in order to be really damn fun. Thank you all for watching. I hope to see you all real soon.